Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Titletown Talk. I'm your host, Ian Ewing. On today's episode, we're going to break down the latest in Packers news, mostly around Goody's availability at the Combine this past week. What do his comments mean for the offseason, stuff like that. We'll talk about the latest rumor mill updates, Jair Alexander being traded. The Packers have made an offer for DK Metcalf, allegedly. And then lastly, we're going to do a little touch on the draft, give you guys a couple names to look out for. Before we start, though, I just wanted to thank all of you for the support. Anybody who's downloaded the podcast, listened to it in any form, I massively appreciate it. We did hit our official 100th download today, so thank you guys for that. Obviously, I really appreciate any support, appreciate the questions, appreciate all of you reaching out and giving feedback. Let's get started. So the first thing we want to talk about is Goody's press conference. So the interesting thing with that, obviously Goody is a general manager in the NFL, so his job is to, make the team better, but his second job is to lie. He literally gets paid to lie. But if you listen closely to Goody, he does give you some breadcrumbs and some sneak peeks and kind of just into his thought process. Every year that he's been the GM, he does that. I think the first time that he's sort of gone against what he said in a press conference is when he said that Aaron Jones would absolutely be back last year, and then they released him. So that's probably the only time I can think of where he hasn't, just given little, breadcrumbs here and there, little hints at what he's doing. So we're going to talk through that. Also, we're going to talk about what Rob Demovsky reported about the Packers in free agency. And then Dan Graziano of ESPN today reported the Packers are looking for a receiver. So who could that be? We're going to talk about all that today. So let's get started with Goody's press conference. Like I said, the first thing he was asked was, if the draft is in Green Bay, does that mean that you guys can't trade your first round pick? And he did swiftly answer and say that that's not the case, that he can trade it, for a player, trade back, whatever. But what was interesting is he said that he had asked Mark Murphy about it. So what does that mean, right? Does that mean he has a plan for the first round pick? Does he want to move back? Does he want to trade for a player, whatever? I think where we'll start is I do think this is probably one of the better drafts I can think of where trading back actually makes a ton of sense. I'm not sure if any of you are nerds about this like I am, but if you are, you would know this draft doesn't have a lot of high-end talent. It's got a lot of starters. People have called it a starters draft. But after the, top 10, 12, maybe 15 players, there's not a lot of blue chip players in this draft. So again, still doesn't mean it's a bad draft, right? I actually would argue there's a lot of depth in this draft, especially at some positions. But with that said, again, what does that mean, right? Does he have a plan for it? Does he want to be open to a plan? Potentially someone calling about it and trading back. Is he going to trade it for Myles Garrett? I mean, we'll see, right? But I would say that just means that he's willing to trade it for the right player, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He also mentioned they're working on a deal with Brandon McManus, the kicker, which I think is a good move. We talked about it on last week's episode. I think he's the only free agent that they need to bring back, and he was very, assertive in saying they've been working on a deal, and I do expect him to be back. He was asked about the offensive line. He said that he really likes the guys they have, but they will, quote, continue to add because of how important the position is. So I don't think that really tells us much other than I don't think they're going to spend big money in free agency on a lineman. With that said, I do think that, in the first 3 to 4 rounds, I expect them to take a lineman, probably an interior guy, but we'll see, right? I expect them to probably just kind of make draft or depth choices in the draft and maybe in free agency, right? I would say that they actually could use a few veterans on the offensive line to help, but they're not going to spend big money on it. So I would say they're probably going to maybe do 2-3 picks in the draft on linemen. Next thing he was asked, this was interesting, if there's a philosophical reason why the Packers don't pick receivers in the first round. Now, the last receiver they picked in the first round was one of my favorite players growing up, Javon Walker, number 84. That was the first Packers jersey that I ever owned. I'm not sure if any of you guys have ever owned a Javon Walker jersey, but I do believe at that time that Mike Sherman was the GM, the coach at the time. Definitely wasn't Ted Thompson, and I don't think it was Ron Wolf, so I'm pretty sure that it was Mike Sherman. So again, not really someone that has the same philosophy as Goody, Ted Thompson, and Ron Wolf. So anyway, when he was asked about that, he said that they've never had a conversation philosophically about not taking a player in the first round. He just said that they've never really been in position to take one that was worth it. If you guys didn't know this is an interesting tidbit. They did try to trade into the first round, like in 2022 with the Vikings. Some of you might not know this. This is a story on that. So the Vikings had the 31st pick, I believe, 31st or 32nd pick. They tried to trade their 2 second-round picks to get back into the first to take Christian Watson. Okay, this has been reported by several different beat reporters, and obviously they drafted him 4 picks later. So we know that's probably true. They just didn't get the yes from the Vikings because the Vikings didn't want them to have the fifth player, the fifth-year option on whatever player they drafted. Okay, so that takes us to 2020. All the big names were gone in 2020. This is the Justin Jefferson, Jalen Reagor, Jamar Chase draft. Again, probably the best receiver draft ever. Oh, sorry, not the Jamar Chase draft. The Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb draft, right? I hear this a lot, guys, and I really apologize if any of you guys are this person, but there's all these people when Jordan Love was picked that were like, oh, they should have drafted a receiver and blah, 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 whatever. They didn't have anybody that was still available when they picked at 28. Now, if you'll remember, they did trade up when they picked Jordan Love in 2020, okay? What's interesting about that, and maybe some of you guys know this, right? This has been reported by several people as well. Brandon Ayuk was the other player that they were going to draft when they traded up in 2020. But the 49ers jumped ahead of Green Bay in that draft and picked him. So then they were just left with Jordan Love. Now, obviously, that worked out well. I think that I would rather have Love at this point. You know, we were able to reset the franchise. But my point is that I don't think that there's any reason that they wouldn't take a receiver in the first round if the right guy is there. You know, Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State is one of my favorites. We'll talk about Jaden Higgins in a little bit from Iowa State. He's one of my favorite players in this draft. He's kind of been a second-round guy, and then he tested at the combine off the freaking charts. And then Matthew Golden from Texas I really like as well. I think that wide receiver in the first round is totally in play this year, depending on if they make a trade for DK, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or maybe sign Adams or whatever. The last thing that Goody said was the most notable, and that was about the defensive line and being able to get pressure with 4, okay? He said it's very important that we get pressure with 4 in order to accomplish our goals this year. I really love the guys we have. We'll see if we add to that room. That was his quote. So again, this is sort of the wink and a nod, like we want to add to that room. What we had last year was not good enough. To me, that is all I needed to hear there. We all know that defensive line and pass rush is probably where they're going to address in free agency and draft. But he basically just said it right there. I think they're going to break the bank for a pass rusher in free agency. And we'll talk about who those might be in a second. But he definitely alluded to the fact that they need more from the defensive line. Peter Bukowski from Locked On Packers and The Leap, he did ask about LVN. And Goody did say that they expect him to take a big leap in 2025. But I still think that's not going to hold them back from picking somebody up in free agency. Now, I do think the fact that he was sort of saying we expect LVN to take a jump, I'm almost wondering if they're hinting at the fact that they're looking interior for their pass rush. I think that's where the strongest talent is in free agency, is in the interior. Now, we'll talk about that in a second, but I do think that there is a close to certainty that that's where Goody's going to be looking in free agency, is for the defensive line. Now, we went through some options last week. I want to give you guys a firm list of who those people might be that they're going to pick up. I fully 100% predict one of these guys will be a Packer. There's Josh Sweat from the Eagles. He's probably the most likely edge guy. Huge fan of him. I think that would be a great pickup. Khalil Mack, we talked about. I think that the Chargers want him back, but I don't know if they're willing to pay him enough. We'll see. Chase Young, the underrated one I haven't heard a lot about for some reason. 25 years old, former second overall pick. I'm a big fan of Chase Young. If any of these people could be the player at edge, that's who I would pick up. The guy we didn't talk about is a guy by the name of Malcolm Kuntz. He's on the Raiders. I kind of forgot about him when I did the free agent episode last week, but he's a very underrated option. He had a massive breakout second half of 2023. He actually had the second highest pressure percentage in the entire NFL. And better than Myles Garrett, better than TJ Watt, better than all the guys we know, Nick Bosa. And then in 2024, this last year, he got hurt, right? He is the typical, if you guys know the Packers, he's the typical guy that they would acquire in free agency. He's a second contract guy. Goody always says this when they pick up people in free agency, his best football's in front of him. I fully agree that he's a Packers type, and he's flying under the radar completely. So keep an eye on him. Malcolm Kuntz is his name. Now we're going to talk about interior. We talked about all these guys already, right? Milton Williams, if I had to bet money, the former Eagle, he's not coming back to the Eagles. He's the most likely Packer, in my opinion. He's exactly what they need on the defensive line. I think he's the best pass rusher available at any position. And he's literally, I think he's 26. He had a 90 pass rush grade from PFF last year. If I were to bet money right now, if you guys said, hey, Ian, who's the most likely person they're going to pick up in free agency? I bet it's Milton Williams. And he is who I would be zeroing in on if you're a Packer fan right now and who they will pick up. So remember the name, Milton Williams. We talked about Levi Onwuzurike from the Lions. Really like him as well. He's probably a lower cost option. We talked about Osa Digizua from the Cowboys, but it was just reported today that they're probably going to franchise him if they can't reach a long-term deal. So I highly doubt that that's going to change. Osa's going to stay with the Cowboys. Dayo Adeyingbo, I cannot say his last name, I apologize, from the Colts. This guy is really kind of an underrated option. He would be more of a depth guy. He is an athletic freak show. He had a pretty good pass rush grade last year for the Colts. Again, another guy who I think could be, a sneaky option. Again, I don't know how to say his last name. Dayo Adeyingbo. My goodness, please don't judge me, guys. I do not know how to say that. The reason I think it's more unlikely than likely that he wouldn't be the option is he's not really a needle mover. They need a guy who can come in and start, who will move the needle and help them get pressure with 4. And that's why I think it's Milton Williams out of this group. Okay, so remember that. Milton Williams will be a Packer. You heard it here first. I hope I'm right. Last but not least, we got breaking news on, I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday, that Jair is being shopped and he will not be back with the team. We knew this already, guys. This is not a surprise. This has been happening for a while. Them shopping him for a trade, I know it might seem like they're going to get this big first, second, third round pick from him because we know how good Jair can be when he's on the field. But I would bet we're going to get maybe a 5th or 6th round pick from him. And here's why. He is going to get cut if he does not get any draft compensation. Now that all it takes is one GM to say, oh, screw it, let's do this, right? And that might be the case with this, right? There might be some GM out there who is 100% absolutely down for Jair, and they want to avoid the bidding war, right? If he goes to free agency, guys, anybody can sign him anytime. So he then gets to choose where he goes. When he's with the Packers and they trade him, the team gets to make that decision. They can offer a higher pick and outbid everybody, and then they'll get to go to that team. If I'm the Packers, I would trade him for a 7th rounder in 2028, somewhere way out in front. If it means he's not going to end up on the Vikings or the Bears, right? That would be a nightmare because you guys know damn well, he's going to be back to playing at an all-pro level next year. And it's going to be with the freaking Vikings because they signed every former Packer, and you guys just know exactly how it's going to go. Like I said, though, I think people are kind of over-anticipating what they're going to get back. I think the best-case scenario, they're probably going to get a 4th-round pick. He's played in half the games the last 2 seasons. Over the last 4 years, he's missed over half the games. When he plays, he's very good, although I would argue he's not an all-pro anymore. People are going to take his injury risk into consideration, the teams that are out there. They have to take his contract into consideration as well. They're going to have to take that contract on if they trade for him. Now, granted, the team can tweak it and mess with it, right? But it's still going to be more of a hindrance than anything else. So I do think there's going to be some team out there that's going to overpay for him because he's still a good player, right? And they want to have his rights themselves. They don't want to get in a bidding war. In the end, I expect maybe a 5th or 6th round pick. You guys can disagree. If I'm wrong on this and it ends up being a third or a second or whatever, I am happy to be wrong. Please be wrong, right? So now let's talk about Rob Demovsky's report. This is really interesting. Rob Demovsky, of course, the ESPN reporter for the Packers, he said he was at the Combine talking to agents and executives, and he said everyone expects Green Bay to be a major player in free agency. So this is interesting, right? I just talked about how I think Milton Williams is going to be the guy they sign. It could be anybody from that list. I do expect fully that list I just gave you guys, one of those guys is going to be a Packer. But him hearing that at the Combine everyone is fully expecting Green Bay to be a player, we don't hear that every year. Now, this is the most cap space they've had since 2019, right? So it's intuitive to think that they would be aggressive, right? But Rob Demovsky, hearing that there, kind of confirms what we all were hoping to hear. He says they're going to be very active in the cornerback market as well as defensive line and wide receivers. Let's talk about wide receivers in a little bit. But again, it kind of just confirms that the Packers see the needs on the team the same way that we do. I think those are the three things they need. They need a cornerback, they need defensive line help, specifically pass rusher help, and then a wide receiver. He also reported that they're very interested in DJ Reed of the Jets, and it was just reported today that DJ Reed will not be back with the Jets. Okay, we talked about him a little bit in the last episode, right? I thought that his size would probably turn the Packers off. He's like 5'9", 185 or something like that, right? I listened to Mike Renner of CBS Sports. He's on a podcast called Pushing the Pile. I highly recommend it if you guys want draft help. He does a great job, right? He's also a Packer fan. He brought up the fact that DJ Reed is one of the best man cover corners in the whole league. And ironically, as you guys know, that's what Jeff Hafley, the Packers defensive coordinator, wants. He wants man corners. And again, this year we played a lot of zone because we don't really have any man corners. I think Carrington Valentine can play man effectively, but when Jair got hurt, they were forced to do a lot more zone coverage. So I think when I was looking at the free agent options last week, I'm like, okay, they're probably not going to pick him, but I think I'm still kind of in that Joe Barry mode and the Mike Pettin mode and even the Dom Capers mode. Yikes. So I do think that they're being interested in DJ Reed is really interesting. And Spot Track, I'm not sure if you guys know what Spot Track is. In PFF, they do like an estimated contract value, and they think his contract is only like a $15 million a year contract. I think that's really reasonable for a guy as good as DJ Reed. He's only 28, so he's not old. He's not a super young guy either, right? But I do think there's an opportunity there for DJ Reed. Now we'll see who else bids for. He's 28 years old, 80 PFF coverage grade last year. I think he makes sense. We talked about some of the other cornerback options, Tarvarius Ward, Paulson Adebo. Byron Murphy is probably the best corner on the market, even above DJ Reed, but I do think the Vikings are probably going to bring him back. Now, with that said, they haven't brought him back yet. They haven't franchise tagged him. They have a lot of options there. They don't have a lot of draft capital. They do have a lot of cap room. But I wouldn't be surprised if, the Packers are interested in him if he does end up sneaking out of the Vikings. So we talked about the defensive line market. I think they're going to sign one of those players we mentioned above. Let's talk about wide receiver really quick. You guys remember when I talked about wide receiver in the last episode. There are not a lot of guys in free agency that make any sense. They're either too old, too small, they haven't had any production for the last few years. The thing is they don't need depth at wide receiver. They need a guy, a number one receiver. And if it just so happens that it can replace Christian Watson's deep threat as well, that's going to be just good as well. So again, we mentioned Davante Adams, and it was reported today that the Jets are trying to trade him right now. If they can't find a trade partner, they're going to release him. I think the Packers will be interested in that. We already know that Davante's interested in a reunion. I think he makes the most sense if they're looking for that veteran number one who's going to get open. This is free agency. I don't think anyone's going to trade for him, by the way. I would say, though, and kind of funny, kind of ironic, the Jets losing DJ Reed means they need a cornerback. Packers have Jair. Wouldn't that be funny if they traded Jair for Davante? That would be crazy. Actually would make a lot of sense, and if that happened, I'd be overjoyed. But again, I think they need a deep threat more than they need a guy who can just get open, right? Christian Watson, when he's not in the lineup, guys, I want to just paint the picture for this. The safeties on the defense, when he's in the lineup, play too deep. and they have to respect his speed. With that said, it takes the defense out of man coverage a lot of times and makes them play zone so they can prevent the deep shots. What happened when Christian Watson was out last year was their defenses manned up a lot more, and they forced the Packers receivers to beat them one-on-one. And for some reason, Matt LaFleur didn't do a lot of scheming them open like I expected him to do. It almost looked a little bit like the McCarthy offense, where they're just like, yeah, go win your one-on-one, try to get open, and Rodgers will throw it to you. That obviously didn't work. We saw what happened the final 3 games there. They lost all 3 of them. I think they need a deep threat. They don't need just a receiver, right? And that's why the free agency market just is very slim. The fact that the Packers are open and interested in wide receivers makes me think they're not going to be able to get one in free agency, so they're going to trade for one. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I do like Darius Slayton from the Giants. I've heard Andy Herman bring him up a little bit from Pack-A-Day Podcast. I think that's an interesting option. He's had 700 yards receiving like 4 or 5 seasons. He's definitely a deep threat guy, but man, Spot Track and PFF are projecting him to make like $15 to $20 million a year, I think. There is no way in hell he's worth that amount of money. Absolutely not. He had a 59 PFF grade last year in receiving grade. He does have some speed. He can stretch the defense the way we're talking about. But again, he's not the guy we're looking for, right? In my opinion, he's not going to change the receiver room and make them like a lot better, right? So to me, Devontae makes sense, and we'll get to trade market in a second. But maybe Chris Godwin from the Buccaneers. He's not going back to the Bucs. He would be that vet number 1 guy. He does get open a lot, but he does have injury concerns, right? He was just hurt last year. He's been hurt a few more times. So I think it's interesting. So, right, we talked about defensive line. We talked about corner. And receiver, just I don't know who the guy is. I genuinely don't. They're not going to sign DeAndre Hopkins or Stephon Diggs. They're way too old, like I said. Hollywood Brown is not the guy they need either. I think a lot of people will laugh when I say this, but what about Marquez Valdez-Scantling, former Packer? I know it's funny, but dude can take the top off and do Christian Watson stuff. And if they're not going to get a number 1 guy, then I think that might be a good option, right? But I digress. Let's get to the final topic, the one I teased everybody about. Reportedly this week, according to a reporter, Seahawks reporter named Corbin Smith, I guess he's a reporter and a podcaster, the Packers are one of 3 teams who have an offer on the table for DK Metcalf, and reportedly they're very confident their trade package is enough to get the deal done. This is what he said. So he's a Seahawks reporter, and shortly after this happened, another Seahawks reporter tweeted out and said, DK Metcalf's not getting traded. Then we see Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers. He also has a newsletter called The Leap. He has sources, I guess, as well. He said he backs Corbin Smith's reporting, and the Packers have made an offer. And then Matt Schneidman of The Athletic, he's a Packers reporter, basically said none of this is true. Corbin Smith comes back and says, I stand by my reporting, so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of a source off going on in the media market, and I do find it interesting, right? And here's, who do we believe is the question, right? It's hard to believe anything at this point, because if that is happening, you could see why the team wouldn't want to leak that. Because, again, the more people that know that DK is available, the more teams get into the mix, and it sort of screws the Packers over. Now, maybe the Seahawks leaked it because they want more teams to get in the mix. But here's why I think this actually is happening, why I do think that they are in trade talks. DK Metcalf is exactly what the Packers need, in my opinion. He's that proven number 1 guy. He's a deep threat. He, ironically, is what they want Christian Watson to be. Except he's always healthy, he's always productive, he's a freak show athlete. He's someone you have to game plan for. Every time you play the Packers, or the Seahawks in this case, you got a game plan for DK. He can beat you deep any minute. He can beat man coverage because he can just out-muscle everybody. He's fast, he runs good routes. He doesn't have like a crazy good route tree. Like obviously Devontae is a much better route runner. I think Dontavian Wicks is also a better route runner, but you know, again, like I said before, what they need is a guy who can force the defense to play more too high, more zone. And that's when LaFleur can really game plan and do what he does best, which is scheme receivers open. You can do more of the screen game that way. When you have the defense manned up on you, obviously that's a problem for a team like the Packers who don't have a lot of man-beating receivers. When you have a guy like DK or Christian, you're going to force the defense to play deep and play more zone, and that's when the Packers win, right? And it's interesting because if they do trade for DK, they're going to need to give him a new contract, okay? Now, his contract is not going to be top of the market. I would expect like a $20, $25 million a year contract, right? If you really think about it, guys, the Packers can afford that any day, right? They have to extend Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs at the end of this season if they play well. In my opinion, you can just go with DK. You can sign Christian Watson to a team-friendly deal, a prove-it deal in 26, right? And then have two of them, right? Would be awesome. Obviously, Christian has the injury, so that's why. They have the money to spend it, and they don't have any money in the receiver room at this point. Because even after this season, guys, they still have another year before Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed are up for a contract. So I do think from a contractual standpoint, there's a lot of room there, right? The cap jumped a crazy amount. It's going to keep jumping. I think that there's a more than realistic chance that this is real. Now, here's what's interesting. Corbin Smith then said that the Seahawks are looking for a first-round pick and a player. Okay? Now, the player is reportedly Dontavian Wicks or Romeo Doubs. And this is what was interesting. And I don't know why a Seahawks reporter would even tweet this, right? If you guys remember during the season, Romeo Doubs was very vocal about, him not being part of the game plan when I forgot who was out, but it doesn't matter. When Romeo had that issue, they suspended him a game, and it was reported that he was pissed at how many targets he was getting, right? I think that spelled the end for Romeo after his contract is up. So I think that Romeo makes a lot of sense to trade for DK. Now, he has 1 year left on his deal. I think a change of scenery could really help, right? I mean, that would make sense to me. Now, ultimately, I don't think the Seahawks are going to get a first rounder for DK, but I could see a second in Dobbs or a third in Dobbs with a conditional pick next year, right? The Seahawks are in a really, really tough cap situation. DK has 1 year left on his deal. I think JSN, Jackson Smith and Jigba, if you guys don't know who he is, he's the person I wanted the Packers to draft instead of LVN, and they didn't. I digress. But they want to feature him. They want him to be the number one guy. And he's, got a couple years left in his contract, 2 years to be specific. I don't think the Seahawks are a playoff contender. In fact, anyone who thinks that they're a Super Bowl contender is insane. But there's also been rumors that they could move on from Geno Smith. So again, there's just a little bit too much smoke here for that to be a little bit of fire. Okay? Seahawks fans are mixed on this about trading DK and getting a pick. I think it makes a ton of sense for them to just rebuild. They got the new coach last year. They're in that tough caps situation. I don't think DK is going to re-sign with them. I just don't. So why not, if you're the Seahawks, get a pick for him when his stock is high? We could go into this next season. They're not going to trade him during the middle of the season, in my opinion. They're going to get a bigger pick now in front of the draft. So I don't know why the Seahawks would even try to hold on to him. If you're going to get a second or third round pick plus Romeo Doubs, or could be Dontavian Wicks too. I would hope it wasn't Wicks. You guys know I think Wicks is awesome. It makes a ton of sense for them to do it. So ultimately, DK is the most likely of all the receiver options out there for the Packers. And I don't think he's just the most likely. He's the best fit. So I want you guys to keep an eye on the DK situation. I think that there's some fire there. Okay. We saw Deebo Samuel get moved for a 5th rounder to Washington. I think that's a good fit for them, by the way. But it can be a good measuring stick for what DK could go for. I think a second or third rounder and then Romeo Doubs makes sense. And if that is the price, they should do it 100%. 100%. Another interesting tidbit, Brandon Ayuk. We just talked about him earlier, how the Packers really liked him. He's going to be available as well. And one thing I'll back up really quick, guys. If you don't know this too, the Packers really, really liked DK Metcalf in the draft. And some of you might know this already. Like, Goody really likes to follow players that he liked. We picked up Andre Dillard last year in free agency. He's kind of steamed out. He's not really what people thought he was going to be when he was drafted, but he really liked Andre Dillard in that draft. So it's kind of funny that he sort of chases and follows these players. So that's why I think another reason DK makes a lot of sense, because we know Goody likes him. It was down to him and Elton Jenkins back in 2019. I ultimately think that they probably should have, knowing what we know now, signed or drafted DK. As much as I like Elton Jenkins, Imagine DK and Devontae and Alan Lazard and MVS on that team. My God, they probably would have won a Super Bowl. Anyway, Brandon Ayuk is available as well. That's interesting. This just came across the wire. I think it was today. They just extended him, and then he tore his ACL this year, I believe. I don't know why the 49ers would move him. I guess they're probably looking to rebuild. Plus, they want to pay Brock Purdy, and Brandon Ayuk's deal is pretty fat. So I don't know if the Packers are, interested in trading for Brandon Ayuk, but he's another option to add to the mix. I just don't see anyone in free agency that makes sense. Now, if Devontae gets cut, he makes the most sense out of all of them. But are the Packers really going to bring Devontae back after they separated back in 2022? I don't know. You guys can tell me. Okay, let's talk about the Combine really quick. My favorite player in this first round was Shamar Stewart. Some of you have asked if I like Mike Green. I do. Shamar Stewart was my favorite prospect. He's an absolute freak show. And I'm like, I think he'll be there at 23 when the Packers pick. Not so much. He tested with a perfect relative athletic score, which we'll talk about in a second. He had the most freaky combine I have ever seen in my entire life. So he's not going to fall to the Packers is what I'm trying to say. But I have a few names we'll look at here in a second. This isn't going to be a draft show, guys, but I want to just kind of intro and preview the draft. So some of you might know this, some of you might not. The Packers really value athletic traits more than they do production in college. Now, you can argue that that's been a problem for them, but Ron Wolf, he was an athletic traits guy. He passed those on to Ted Thompson, and Ted passed them to Brian Gutekunst. So they really value athleticism. There's a metric out there, or I guess a series of metrics called RAS scores. RAS, R-A-S, Relative Athletic Score. If you guys look up RAS score NFL, it'll take you to a site and it will show you. Now, it's a sliding scale of 0 to 10. A 10 is a perfect relative athletic score. 0 is terrible. If they have a high relative athletic score, it typically is correlated to the Packers liking that person. Now, with that said, I'll give you guys an example. Brian Branch, the Lions safety, right? He was picked a pick after the Packers took Luke Musgrave, I believe. He had a really poor relative athletic score coming out of Alabama, which is what made him fall to the second round, even though his tape was a first-round tape all in all. Now, again, I think that it should be a mix of athletic scores and production. And so do the Packers, right? They're not just going to sign, some freak athlete. There has to be production as well, right? But they typically they have certain thresholds they look for. And we'll talk about those thresholds as we start previewing the different positions, right? And we'll start draft stuff next week. I can't wait, by the way. Now that the combine has happened, we know everybody's athletic testing. We can start previewing who are Packers types at what positions. We're going to use the consensus board, PFF, NFL Network, Daniel Jeremiah, Mel Kiper, the ESPN guys. Todd McShay has his own thing now. We'll look at all the different draft boards and sort of compile who could be there when the Packers pick first, second, third round, whatever. Here are 5 guys who are Packers types who you should keep an eye on. The first one's Darian Porter from Iowa State. He's a cornerback. The Packers really like speed at corner, and they like, obviously, lateral quickness. And if you think about the corner position, that makes a lot of sense. But they like tall and long athletes. If you guys look at Kevin King, for example. I know Kevin King is a bit of a laugher, and, Kevin King will forever be remembered as the person they picked instead of TJ Watt. I will also think that way, by the way. I try not to dwell on it, but it hurts. They like long corners with a lot of speed and lateral quickness, right? That's why they liked Eric Stokes. Now, Jair Alexander is a bit of a offshoot of that, a little bit of an exception to the rule, but Jair was a freak athlete. He had a 9.09 relative athletic score, right? Darian Porter is 6'4", 200 pounds, which is huge for a corner, and he's got athletic traits off the charts. He had a perfect RAS score, 9.98, which is insane. Darian Porter is probably a second-round pick. I don't think he'll be there he's not a guy I would pick in the first round, but I do think that, in the consensus board, he's 43 right now, and there's a good chance that he could be there when the Packers pick in the second. Another guy, Derek Harmon, defensive tackle from Oregon. I love his tape. He also, I don't think he did scores, or he didn't do testing. He doesn't have a score. But he's a guy who I've been starting to see mocked to the Packers in the first round. He's a defensive tackle, interior defensive lineman. I mentioned earlier, I think that they're going to go defensive line in free agency, but they'll also more than likely pick somebody in the draft. Kenny Clark's probably going to be in his last season this year. And if you know the Packers, they like to kind of backfill that, so they have somebody ready to take Kenny Clark's job when he leaves. So if you pick up a Milton Williams, for example, he's more of a pass rush specialist. He's not a nose tackle. Derek Harmon can do all of it. I'm a huge, huge fan of Derek Harmon. Next one, Jaden Higgins. Love him. He's an Iowa State wide receiver. He had a crazy combine, and he was kind of thought of as a second-round pick, but he tested off the charts at the combine this week. Super tall, super athletic. They like, for receivers, guys, just so you know, they like 6'2" and over. The receiver has to be over 200 pounds, and they won't even look at you, right? They like tall and athletic, right? Think about Christian Watson. Dontavian Wicks is that way. Jordy Nelson's that way, right? If they're smaller, they're going to be like Greg Jennings, Jaden Reed, bigger guys who are slots, but they already have a slot guy in Jaden Reed. Jaden Higgins, Iowa State wide receiver, go look him up. One other thing, guys, that you should know about Goody and the Packers, they really like to pick people that were at the Senior Bowl and especially performed well at the Senior Bowl. Jaden Higgins was a Senior Bowl guy, so was Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, by the way. Evan Williams, the safety they drafted last year, Senior Bowl guy. They really like the Senior Bowl. The other thing is they like, when they do their top 30 visits for the draft, they like to pick from the top 30 visits as well. So that'll give us another preview into who the Packers' options are. But Jaden Higgins. Jack Beck, wide receiver TCU. He's more of a second-round pick. Jaden Higgins, who I mentioned previously, is a second-rounder up to the combine. A lot of people saying he could go in the first now, and I could see the Packers picking him in the first round. Jack Beck, however you say it, second-round guy, Senior Bowl, really smooth route runner. Really like his tape. Not just because he's a white wide receiver, but he kind of reminds me of Jordy a little bit. Just really fluid and smooth, great hands. And he showed out at the Senior Bowl, by the way. He's the guy that wore his brother's number. His brother was, I believe, killed in the New Orleans incident. Super sad. Jack Beck is somebody I really, really like. Last guy, Trey Amos, cornerback from Ole Miss. He's my favorite cornerback prospect in the entire draft. He's got, the size that Green Bay wants. He's super athletic. He tested where they need him to be. Really, really big fan of Trey Amos. So anyway, that's going to do it for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I know this went a little bit long. We're going to start draft stuff next week. I apologize, by the way, that there was a little bit of a gap between episodes. It's been a crazy couple weeks, but we're going to start draft prep next week, and we're going to either do it the week after or potentially 2 next week. I'm going to do a review of all the positions the Packers had this year. So we're going to go through cornerback all the way through kicker, give them a score, decide who has a future with the team, who doesn't, who will be here, and then give them a grade, right? Preview, Jordan Love, B plus probably, right? So we're going to do that for another episode, and then we're going to start digging into the draft, guys. And then as we go, if there's any news, if the Packers end up, trading for DK or Brandon Ayuk or whoever, Devontae Adams maybe, we'll do a breaking news episode and get into that. But really appreciate you guys listening. Give it a download, give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, whatever you can do to help. I massively appreciate it either way. And thank you guys for listening. I'll see you next week. Go Pack, go.